Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever you are. This is one of our last conversations of the year. It's an opportunity to remind everyone that we have a campaign. It's in its closing days. This is an important time, as you know, for Israel, for ELNET, for international relations, to support Israel, the coalition that we are working very hard to maintain and expand. By and large, looking back, this has been a very dramatic year, a year that began with a lot of pain. And we, of course, Israel and supporters of Israel around the world are paying a very high price in terms of what we've seen right now. It looks like Israel has the upper hand vis-a-vis Iran and the axis and circle of fire surrounding Israel, but never say never. There's still chaos in Syria. There's still uncertainty in Lebanon and in Gaza. There's still the Iranian nuclear program to pay attention to. There's still pressure on Jordan and, of course, the West Bank. So there is much to do, although we should certainly be proud of those fighting on behalf of Israel day and night. And there's a lot to do in terms of Israel's diplomatic challenges ahead. And Europe here being an essential part of the Western alliance, together with the United States, and of course, a new administration coming in January. There is much uncertainty and much need for alliance building and alliance maintenance when it comes to Israel and the international community. So please pay attention to what you can still do in terms of supporting ELNET. We had nearly 35 delegations this year and around 10 strategic dialogues and other programs. Will do more or less the same in 2025. It's an incredible pace, and I want to thank our team and especially thank Daniel, our moderator today, who will be leaving us for other pastures very soon. So Daniel, thank you for your service, and of course to our speaker today, Yaakov Katz, who's absolutely phenomenal. So without further ado, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you for the kind words. Thank you all for joining us today for the symbolic last call of 2024. And yet it feels like October 2023 has never left us. There are still 100 dead and living hostages in Gaza. And for that reason, and many others, 2024, at least from our perspective here in Israel, has gone by faster than expected and was full of maybe too many historical and unprecedented events. We often now cynically joke here that the emotional bar for newsworthy information has reached levels beyond our imagination. As in, if hundreds of beepers don't explode simultaneously in 3 Middle Eastern countries, is it even news? If Iran doesn't launch the biggest ballistic attack the world has ever seen from one country to another, is it even a threat? But now, jokes aside, Israel has lost 816 soldiers since October 7, 23. The war is still on. Tens of thousands of rockets were fired from 7 different countries towards Israeli civilians, including one ballistic missile fired from Yemen by the Houthis, which sent me, my family, and thousands of others to shelters just today. So from the ceasefire in Lebanon to the fall of the Assad regime through the Iranian nuclear threat, an incoming Trump administration, a European continent turning right at every election intersection, with a new election announced just earlier today in Germany, expected but announced today. What's left for 2025 to impress us and shock us after such a tumultuous year? To decipher all this, we are pleased to be joined by renowned American-Israeli journalist and author, Mr. Yaakov Katz, originally from Chicago, former editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post and a lecturer in advanced journalism at Harvard University. He has shaped the discourse on critical issues in the Middle East. Prior to taking up the role in the Jerusalem Post in 2016, Mr. Katz has served as the senior policy advisor to Naftali Bennett for 2 years during his tenure as Israel Minister of Economy and Minister of Diaspora Affairs. Yaakov Katz is also the author of 3 acclaimed books. Thank you again, Yaakov, for joining us today. And to begin, before going global, as they say, I'd like to first turn to the internal situation in Israel during the last year, as we have enough to do with our own, apparently. 2024 kicked off with Israel being in the peak of its war efforts in Gaza. The war cabinet, so-called, with Benny Gantz was still in place. Nasrallah and Assad were still amongst the strongest leaders in the region. A year later, almost a year later, Gideon Sa'ar is now Minister of Foreign Affairs, broke his alliance. He's now part of the growing Netanyahu coalition. Benny Gantz is now in the opposition, trying to pick up what's left of his popularity of the beginning of the war. So how did we get here, and where do you see this political roller coaster going in the year ahead?
Well, first of all, Daniel, it's great to be with you and David and everyone else here at ELNET. Big fan of the organization. I think you guys do really amazing work in building the alliances that David alluded to earlier around the world, and particularly in places like in Europe on the continent where we definitely need that help today. And watching just news, for example, yesterday of Israel deciding to close an embassy in Ireland, a ferocious, vicious anti-Semitic country, but it just underscores the importance of the work that you do. So let me first commend all of you. To your question, I mean, if we're here for what we got, 2-3 days straight to talk about, the Israeli political system, because that's how long it would take. But the short version is that, I mean, first of all, it would be very hard if on October 7th, someone would have said to me, we'd be in a reality 15 months later, where Netanyahu's government would not have only not shrunk, but would actually have been enlarged, where his arch nemesis Gideon Sa'ar, who had promised never to sit with him again, had run against him, had said that Netanyahu's term needs to come to an end, is now sitting in his government as the foreign minister, where 15 months ago, someone would have said that we would be at a point that the entire Hezbollah leadership would be decimated and eliminated, that Hamas would literally be close to ceasing to exist, where the Iranians would be likely at their most vulnerable and exposed and weak moment in history. I don't know that I would have believed that's possible. I don't know that many Israelis would have believed that's possible. I don't know that many people around the world would have thought. I mean, just by way of a story, on when Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, was eliminated and killed in that airstrike in September, and it was on a Friday night, took place just before Shabbat was beginning here in Jerusalem. And I remember Shabbat morning, walking in the morning to Beit Knesset, to synagogue, to shul with one of my children, and looking up at the sunny sky. And I thought to myself, if someone had told me just a few months ago that Israel would eliminate Hassan Nasrallah and that we would be walking outside in the sun on our way to synagogue just a few hours later, I would have said, no way in hell. But that's the reality. So we really have, to an extent, of course, Assad's collapse now, we really have, to an extent, in the most tragic of circumstances, re-engineered the Middle East. And this has changed before our eyes in historic proportions. But I also think that politically, Netanyahu has mastered the art of survival here in Israel. And it really is a unique characteristic of this politician, this prime minister. It's to his, I say it with admiration, at the same time with criticism. Admiration that he's able to achieve this, but criticism that he does constantly, unfortunately, put his political survival at the top of his priorities, sometimes overtaking the national priority. That would be my criticism. But with that said, I can be critical of him and at the same time applaud him for how this region has changed. And that is also somewhat to his credit.
Indeed. And so with all that, we just hear a little bit of briefings today in the news. Everything is very much behind the scenes, but it is apparent that we might go into some sort of a hostage deal, a long-awaited one. How do you see this going? Because a lot of people are saying that there are a lot of opportunities that have been missed in the past. Last ceasefire was in November, which is over a year ago. How is this going to impact the political spectrum here in Israel? And hopefully all the hostages will come back, of course. But this has been the most burning issue in his stability.
No, 100%. I mean, I'll say a couple of things on that. First of all, from my personal opinion, for what it's worth, I think there's no more important objective to what Israel needs to achieve right now than to bring back the hostages, even at the price of ending the war, even at the price of a prisoner exchange and having to release murderers. I think that after 15 months of having Israelis in captivity, there are people who are alive in Gaza, and we have an obligation to bring them back. And I'll break it down for three very simple reasons. One, we have to save them, right? We sent them to the border to live or to serve. They were taken from their beds or from their bases. We owe them to bring them back. Two, we have to worry about the message we are sending to other of our pioneers on borders throughout this country, whether it's in the north or the south, and the prospect that one day they might be taken hostage. What message are we sending them? Why would someone put their life on the line to live in the north or on the eastern front or on the southern front? And three is we will never be, and soldiers, what message are we sending them when they want to enlist in the IDF? That we won't bring them back when we know they're alive and they're just over the border? But three, which I think is just as important, is how will we heal as a nation? We will not be able to come to put this behind us. We'll never be able to really put behind us what happened on October 7th. But without bringing back the hostage, we definitely will not be able to. So we need that to be able to go through the process of national healing that is so required for this country. The problem is, and this is the brilliance of what Hamas did on October 7th, when they grabbed and took hostage 251 people, was that they knew that this is a vulnerable point for Israel, because what it put Israel into a situation of where, imagine if I said to the people who are on this call months ago, I can end the war, Hamas will no longer govern Gaza, but I will not have brought back the hostages. Is that a victory? Some people might say yes, some people might say no. I could have alternatively said, I will make a deal to bring back all the hostages, but it will leave Hamas in charge of Gaza. They will still have infrastructure, fighters, rockets, and they will, more importantly, still be the governing entity of the Gaza Strip. Many people, some might say yes, but many people would have said that's also not a victory. So no matter which way you went here, you were stuck in a very difficult position from the get-go. So anyone who just points a finger at Benjamin Netanyahu and says it's his fault, he doesn't want to deal, that's simplifying matters. I think, yes, he did drag out, and yes, he did stall at times, and yes, it was because of politics at times also. But we can't just negotiate with ourselves. I've heard from top U.S. administration officials, including Brett McGurk, who was one of the people really involved here in the talks between the different sides, is that definitely up until a couple months ago, it was Hamas that was refusing to really agree to a deal. So this whole idea, as if it's just Netanyahu and his coalition, that's also not being sincere. It's being disingenuous. With that said, it seems that there is a dramatic change. And I think the dramatic change is the result of three primary factors. Number one, Israel has really weakened and degraded Hamas. They're left with nothing. Yeah, they have some fighters, they have some infrastructure. If we continue to create a vacuum in Gaza, they will rebuild. And I think that's the big problem right now with Gaza, is who is going to replace Hamas as the governing entity. But they're on the ropes, and even further down, they're on the floor. That's one. Two is time is running out. We see what's happening, and this is from our side. We understand that the hostages, the time is not on their side. We saw what happened to the 6 hostages who were killed when Israeli soldiers got close to them a few months ago, back in August, I think it was, right? We know that when Israel is not, when there's not a deal, even hostages of high prominence, of high profile, Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who ministers in the Israeli government, had told his parents, don't worry, your son is the most valuable hostage. They'll never touch a hair on his head. Well, he was shot in the head and killed. So we don't have time. But third, I think, is also the Trump effect. The Trump effect, the fact that Donald Trump will be taking office on January 20th, has made a lot of these rogue actors here in the region understand that they need to start to cut their losses and try to begin with a clean slate. We saw that with Hezbollah. We're seeing that now with Iran, with the overtures they're making towards Donald Trump. And I think Hamas is also understanding. We saw the Trump statement just about, 7-10 days ago, that all hell will break loose or something along those lines if the hostages aren't back by January 20th. This has an impact. Don't underestimate the value of what that type of message and statement does, even to the vicious, barbaric, violent terrorists of Hamas. So all in all together, there are a lot of different issues at play that make it possible for a deal right now. It could always go sideways, but as of now, it seems that maybe even within the next couple of weeks, we'll see the beginning process, first stage of what might be a longer multi-stage hostage deal.
And you've touched on a lot of points here that we'll get to in just a second, which impacts a bit of more the international aspect of it. But I want to touch upon one of the internal aspects you've mentioned, the message we send soldiers when we call upon them to protect our borders. One of the most volatile, inflammable, call it whatever dramatic adjective you want, in Israel is the draft bill that have been talked about so many times, and is one of the reasons that the government might collapse or will ever be, if it not again postponed. Or what's your take on this? Because we are approaching now again the end of 2024. We need to vote for a budget, and the ultra-Orthodox parties are still objecting this bill. What's your take on that?
Look, I'll tell you, it drives me crazy, to be honest, that there are still people in this country who don't understand and recognize the gravity of the situation. We are short soldiers. We do not have enough soldiers. I have a daughter who's an officer in the IDF. I have another daughter who will be drafting quite soon. I have 3 nephews, triplets of my brother-in-law, triplet boys, same age as my daughter. One is serving in an elite unit called Egos, was part of an operation just a few months ago. It only was revealed a couple of weeks ago, where soldiers from Egos went into Syria, grabbed an Iranian agent and brought him back to Israel. He was one of those soldiers. I have his 2 brothers, 2 of the triplets. One is in a unit called Sayeret Sanchanim, the elite paratroopers unit. Another one is in the Sayeret Golani, the elite Golani unit. Both are now finishing up officers training. They're going to become officers. I don't know how my brother-in-law or sister-in-law sleep at night. But also in my family, in that same family, I have another nephew who is studying in yeshiva, who is ultra-Orthodox, who refuses to serve. There are a lot of Israeli families like mine today that are divided and split. You can imagine what goes on at the Katz Shabbat table when we're all together. Not simple.
I'd rather not.
But I think that the reality today in a post-October 7th Israel is that we need everyone who can help carry this burden, right? We have over almost 1,000 soldiers who have been killed, over 800 now. We have over 15,000, I think, who have been wounded. Some have gone back to service. Many have not been able to. The missions and the operations, the challenges for Israel have only grown. Think now, go back to where we were on October 6th. I just finished writing a book called While Israel Slept. It'll come out next fall, about what happened and how in the run-up to October 7th. Think back to the number of soldiers, troops, intelligence gathering, collection devices, etc., that we had along our different borders. Take Lebanon as just one example. On the morning of October 7th, we had about 7 battalions along the border with Lebanon, right? So that's about 4,000, 5,000 soldiers, let's say. By the next morning, we already had multiplied it by almost 10 because we feared an invasion. So now you want to go back to the way you were before? You can't. You don't have to stay at these high, crazy levels that you went to, but you got to find a new way to do border security. We can't leave our borders unmanned the way we did before. So we don't, who's going to do it? We don't have people. Now, the ultra-Orthodox leadership, sadly, is failing to recognize this moment in time and are still using their political clout and their political power to extort the government and to get what they want, which is an exemption. The fact that the Likud party and the prime minister are even contemplating giving them this, in my eyes, is a grave sin and a betrayal of the national priority of what this country requires and needs. But it's about political expediency. I hope that the Likud party ultimately, and there are voices already that you're hearing within the rank and file of Netanyahu's party, refuse to vote for this, stand up to this Haredi demand, even at the cost and the price of the coalition potentially falling apart. Now, it's easy to say. Netanyahu is very nervous. He's on trial. He's taking, just today again, he testified in the Tel Aviv District Court in his corruption trial. The last thing he wants is to be up for an election in a government that was until now quite stable, and elections are not really required for another 2 years. But there is something that is called doing what's right. I want to hope that that happens. And the fact of the matter that 13% of our population, which is what the Haredim constitute more or less, 1.3 million, still don't understand that the situation has changed. You know, before October 7th, Daniel, we could have had this conversation. It would have been theoretical. We could have said it's not fair, it's not right. But you know what? Fine. Okay. But now we all know we need them. There's about 50,000, maybe more, men, ultra-Orthodox men, who are in the age exemption range. So it's about from 18 till about 24, 25. These are people who could serve now. We need them now. And the fact that they don't understand this is, in my eyes, it's I'll tell you something even more maybe extreme. It's anti-Jewish. That's what it really is. It's against the values, I think, of our people, of our religion, of our tradition. And I hope it changes.
Here. You talked about October 6th in Lebanon. So if I turn a little bit north, what we've seen in the past few months has been, there's no words to describe how historical and unprecedented it was, from Nasrallah to the beepers to Assad falling. But the bottom line is the Iranian axis has been weakened. The supply chain through Iran, Iraq, Syria to Lebanon with the destination of Hezbollah has been somewhat broken. There's a ceasefire now in Lebanon. Will that stand? Will Israeli civilians be willing to go back to their houses? As you said, they're those who were sent to live and those who were sent to protect. So there's so many communities that have been mainly destroyed, and some of them, even if not, will civilians will feel safe to go back? Will the ceasefire hold? The Golan Heights has now been a new front. The IDF chief of staff has said we have opened a new Syrian front, which has been reported in the media as somewhat controversial. How do you see the north? And I'll add to that, because there's never enough players in the Middle East, of course. Turkey has now been involved in Syria as well. And well, if Syria becomes the new proxy like Iran was to Syria, it's also another challenge, enemy, adversary on our borders.
Well, because it's never boring here, the reality is extremely complicated and volatile. There's no doubt. I think before I answer specifically about Syria and Lebanon, I do want to just say one more general comment. And that is, I think, what we all have to remember about this region. There never is a vacuum that is ever filled by a moderate, liberal element. It just doesn't happen. Think about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. How many hours till the Taliban took over? Think about our withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, the dreams and aspirations that it would turn into the Singapore of the Middle East. It turned into the hell of the Middle East. Think about our withdrawal from Lebanon. We had an 18-year security zone in southern Lebanon. We pulled out in May of 2000. Within 5 months, they kidnapped 2 or 3, I think 3 soldiers along the border. 6 years later was the second Lebanon war. Another 2 soldiers kidnapped. And of course, now the last 15 months. Mubarak falls in Cairo back in 2011, 2012. Who's the first, who gets elected right away? Mohammed Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood. It just, Libya, and I could go on and on and on. That's the reality. So when you understand that, it should give pause to understanding what's happening in the region. Why do I say that? Is because just take an example last week, Syria. The rebels, the HTS, the Hayat Tahrir al-Shams, what they recognized was an opportunity that had presented itself to them. And with the weakening of Hezbollah, Iran's inability to support Assad, Hezbollah's inability to support Assad, they saw that they could potentially barrel through the country, and they did. And they took down all of Assad's army. Hezbollah not able to come to his rescue, Iran fleeing the country, and now they're effectively in control. There's, of course, still the Kurds, you got the Druze, you got the Alawites on the coast, you got the Russians and their thing. The whole country is a big mess. Now, Israel's interest in Syria is obviously in having a stable Syria, a Syria that does not pose a threat to us. But so what did we go ahead and do, which was brilliant, was in airstrikes that mounted to about 350, maybe even 400 different airstrikes, took out all of the strategic weaponry that Assad had accumulated over the years. Fighter jets, MiGs, Sukhois, Navy warships, anti-ship missiles, surface-to-air missile systems, SAMs, air defense systems, Scud missiles, other missiles, and of course some of the chemical weapons that he held on to even after he was supposed to get rid of all of them back in 2013. We did the world a huge favor. We first and foremost preserved our security, but we saved the world from having these sophisticated weapons fall into the hands of these rebels, who, by the way, who are these rebels? This HTS is just a rebrand of what the Nusra Front was, which is an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, right? So I'm on BBC last week in an interview explaining what Israel has done, and then the anchor woman says to me, but, you know, the UN has condemned Israel for these airstrikes. Don't you think Israel should stop? And I said, no, I don't think Israel should stop. And I said, let me explain to you, this isn't the Labour Party of Keir Starmer that is coming to power now in Syria. These are radical Islamic Salafite terrorists. Now, we have to wait to see what happens. But does the world want chemical weapons falling into their hands? And the next thing we know, blowing up in some train station in Madrid or Amsterdam? Of course not. So, I mean, we have to keep focused on what is the nature of this threat. That's in Syria, and Israel's remaining vigilant. It's gone into the buffer zone, which is, some of you might remember, after the Yom Kippur War of 1973 in the ceasefire agreement of 74, there was an area in southern Syria that was meant to be demilitarized. You have a UN force called UNDOF, the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, whose job it is to ensure that the area does remain demilitarized. They count the amount of guns and tanks and artillery cannons that were always on both sides of that border. Obviously not as relevant anymore because this rebel force won't necessarily respect that agreement. That's Israel's concern. We do not want to find a situation where we have normalized having armed men along our border in the Golan Heights. By the way, I mean, you want to hear another absurdity? The United Nations had condemned Israel just days before for its occupation of the Golan Heights, right before the rebels came in a vote at the UN General Assembly. Have they lost their minds? Who should we give it to now? We should give it to Al-Qaeda? I mean, sometimes it's just so crazy and delusional what we see on the international front. That's on Syria. So we're in the buffer zone right now, remaining vigilant, watching, eliminating the strategic weapons, taking those off the chessboard, and now waiting to see what will happen with the rebels. Muhammad Abu Jalani the leader, is making some interesting comments, but we will of course have to wait to see what happens. Now, Hezbollah in Lebanon is obviously a very different situation. The reason it's a different situation is because while the war has now come to an end, Hezbollah has not come to an end. It has been weakened. Its leadership has been destroyed. Lots of its capabilities have been removed, but it's still there with thousands of fighters and tens of thousands of rockets. Israel has done a good job in clearing out southern Lebanon, but the rest of Lebanon has pretty much been left intact, except for some areas in the Dakhia, that's the suburb of Beirut, the stronghold of Hezbollah, and some parts in the northeast, the Bekaa Valley, where they also are known to have some of their bases and different storage centers. But they still have a lot of capabilities. They're there waiting. They will rearm, they will rebuild. Now, for the time being, it's going to be more difficult to get those weapons to them. Naim Qassem, the new leader of Hezbollah, the Secretary General, even said that publicly in a speech the other day, where he said, because of what happened in Syria, it's going to be difficult for us to get the weapons, because the way they would come from Iran to Syria, and then Syria, they would just cross the land border. There was a land bridge near the area of Homs in the northwest of Syria, and they would go from there straight into Lebanon. That's going to be more difficult today. But they'll figure out ways. Give them time. The challenge for Israel is going to be, okay, we know that Hezbollah is in the north. We know that they have some positions still in Beirut. Our objective in this war was to clear out the South, to be able to let the 60,000, 70,000 Israelis who had to evacuate their homes go back home. What happens tomorrow if we see a Hezbollah terror cell walking around with rockets? Well, tomorrow's an easy answer. We attack and kill them, right? Because we have retained operational freedom. We received the American approval for that. And we're going to keep doing that because we need to keep operating. But the question that I wonder, Daniel, is what will happen in August? 8 months from now, when the Zimmerim, right, the little vacation homes up north, the little hotels are all full of people vacationing once again in the Golan or in the northern Galilee. And the school year is about to begin and tourism is great. And then we see people walking around with rockets. And then it comes to the prime minister. And the prime minister has to say, 1 second, I should attack. I should retain this preemption policy, because if I don't, I could slip back to that containment policy, which brought me October 7th. And they'll think that they can get away with it, which I can't allow to happen. But if I also attack, they will respond. All the Zimmers, all the hotels will empty out. The school year might be postponed, so maybe it's better to wait. And that's where it will get complicated. So I don't judge what's happening based on now. I judge what's going to happen a year from now. And I think this is going to be a huge challenge for Israel. I remember as a reporter, ahead of the disengagement from Gaza, you know, we were brought down to the border by Sholem Mofaz, who was then the defense minister. I was at briefings with Ariel Sharon, who was the prime minister at the time. And they all said some version or the other of, if one rocket is fired after we pull out, we'll blow them back to kingdom come. Well, we didn't. And we didn't do it after one rocket, and we didn't do it after two, and we didn't do it after 2,000, 5,000, 10,000, or 15,000. October 7th was no surprise in that sense. We let them get to that stage. We have to prevent that from happening ever again. And the only way to do that is to use a policy of preemption, of constantly acting against the threats as they present themselves. Now, I'm sorry to go on, but just two other comments about that. What it means effectively for Israel, and I know that everyone on this call cares deeply about Israel, but what it means effectively for Israel is that, sadly, we are going to have to continue fighting all the time. So what you see, for example, in the West Bank, where every night Israeli troops go into Jenin, Tulkarm, Kalkilia, Hebron, wherever it is, Nablus, and round up terror suspects and break up bomb labs and arrest people, which has become the norm, right? That's how we've kept terror to a low in the West Bank ever since the Second Intifada. To do that, we're going to have to do that now in Gaza. We're going to have to do that now in southern Lebanon. So tying back to your question before, Daniel, about the ultra-Orthodox as an example, look at how more robust, significant the challenges and the military operations are going to have to be in the years to come.
Thanks for that. A lot to uncover, but we'll move forward. And before I turn to Q&A, I'd like, again, to ask, let's say, the million-dollar question, because all of that goes down to that one small, tiny, an important country called Iran, right? And at the end of the day, this is what it's all about. And we have a new administration coming in January, as you said, in the US. And we've seen a week in Iran now. Many reports are kind of trying to describe the damages that Israel has done in the attack in October on Iranian air defense, or allegedly some nuclear facilities, et cetera, et cetera. But now there's more talk about a potential preemption. Like you said, if you won't do something before the risk amounts itself, we would be at risk even more. So what's the new policy now? Is Iran now vulnerable and it's time to do the million-dollar, again, attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities, if it's even possible, because there's a few? And if so, will it be done by Israel, by the US, jointly?
So I smile. I actually wrote a piece last week in Newsweek where I said that now is the time for Israel to attack Iran's nuclear facilities. My last book, called, so I'll plug, if I wasn't an author, how I would, if not plugging my own book, but my last book was called Shadow Strike, which is about Israel's bombing of Syria's nuclear reactor in 2007. Israel is the one country in the world that has twice destroyed the nuclear reactor of its enemies. 1981, Osirak outside of Baghdad, 2007, the Al-Kibar reactor being built in Deir ez-Zor in northeastern Syria. Now, the question we have to ask ourselves is why in both of those cases did Israel do it when it did it? And why for so long that we've been warning about what Iran is building and what it's amassing and what it's creating, we have not done? Now, there's three answers why, for the most part. The first is look at Osirak and look at Al-Kibar, Iraq and Syria, both one single facility above ground. Each one had its complexities. Each one had its challenges from an operational standpoint, but relatively simple in terms of destroying. Once destroyed, you knew you had set them back a significant period of time. You also knew you had set them back a significant period of time because unlike Iran, both of those countries did not have the domestic technical know-how or expertise. Iraq's reactor was being built by the French. Syria's reactor was being built by North Korea. So for them to rebuild once destroyed, they would have had to once again rely on foreign intervention, on someone coming in and building it for them. With Iran, you have facilities scattered across the country, some of them heavily fortified underground bunker systems, like Natanz, where they have their main enrichment facility for uranium, or Fordo near the city of Qom. So difficult to penetrate, difficult to get to throughout the country, not just one set of targets. And two is all the technical data, all the know-how, all the expertise and knowledge is domestic. It's local. So you can destroy facilities. You can't destroy what's in someone's brain. They can rebuild. And when you attack them, a regime which is to a large extent opposed by a lot of its own people, you will be solidifying, uniting the people behind the regime, because the regime will say to their people, this is exactly why we need nuclear weapons. We told you the Zionists are plotting against us. They want to undermine our right for self-determination, for sovereignty, for power, for freedom, blah, blah, blah. And then the people who once opposed them on the streets will now stand behind them. That is the complexity. And that is what has held us back for a long time. But there's two other reasons we have held back. One is the question of whether we could even do it. And that ties into the distance, to the air defense systems, to the heavily fortified facilities. Well, in April and in October, over 100 fighter jets, and not in both, but in October 100, in April a few less, flew the distance to Iran and destroyed targets in Iran territory, including all of their 4 S-300 Russian-made surface-to-air missile systems, their air defense systems. Iran's airspace today is completely wide open. They do not have a way to defend themselves. We not only managed to fly that distance, but we have managed to open up the skies over Iran for our pilots to be able to operate there freely in the future. So, number one, yes, we can now get there. And we can do what we want to do over Iran. Number two, can we penetrate their facilities? Well, still an open question, but I think that we can. And I think that if you want to get proof of how we can, look at the bombing of the bunker where Hassan Nasrallah was killed in Beirut. 80 tons of weapons were dropped and munitions. Israel has developed a capability to basically use missiles as a drill. Literally, not an exercise, a drill, like to drill a hole. You fire one after the other into the same space, in the same little dot. And you literally, with bunker busters, you punch a hole through until you penetrate into the main facility. So Israel has developed this tactic, has used it effectively, and could also be applied to Iranian targets. So that's one. The other reason that Israel hasn't attacked until now is because of the fear from the retaliation, right? We were afraid that if we attack 150,000 rockets and missiles from Hezbollah, Syria's Scuds and chemical weapons, Iran's ballistic missiles, the Houthis in Yemen. Daniel, you were in a bomb shelter earlier today because of a Houthi missile that was fired from Yemen. The Hamas arsenal. Well, we're now in a reality that doesn't exist anymore. Assad gone, his strategic weapons gone, Hezbollah weakened, Yes, they could fire some rockets, but we already know how to deal with what they have left. Hamas, nothing. The Houthis, again, we can deal with that. And Iran, which has already fired 500 ballistic missiles our way, some of them have caused damage. But I feel like with CENTCOM, with Central Command in America, we can deal with that too. So the whole scope of the fear of the retaliation is completely shrunk. Therefore, this is a unique moment in history for Israel to potentially do what needs to be done, to use military means to remove this threat that has hovered above our heads for so long. Now, as I say that, let's look at what Iran is doing. The IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog based in Vienna, recently announced that they've quadrupled the amount of uranium to the level of 60%. That is just shy of the 90% that they require for HEU, for high enriched uranium. They are plowing ahead. They are setting up more and more of the pieces that they will require for one day when they decide to go to the breakout stage, when they decide to break out to the bomb and to actually build a nuclear device. Now, they could enrich uranium to 90% and get what's called the SQ, the significant quantity of enriched uranium that they require for 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 nuclear weapons in a very short time. It doesn't yet mean they have the weapon, because the weapons program is a separate track, which takes a little longer. But they could, once they have the HEU, the high enriched uranium, they could announce we're a nuclear power. That would change the dynamics and shift power here in the region. Is Israel going to do it? I don't know. I want to hope that the incoming administration, the Trump administration, recognizes also this moment in time and doesn't say to itself, okay, the way to achieve an end to the program is another nuclear deal. That will be the easy way to go. And I have a feeling that's going to be the direction they're going to go. But they see that might be good, and it might delay them. But it's exactly what Iran wants. We will once again play into their hands. Iran has to be punished and has to feel the pain for what it has done here in this region and for building an illicit nuclear program all these years. And the only way to get them to recalculate is for them to be presented with a credible military threat and real military action. So again, what happens? All of us can take a guess, but we can't ignore that there is a unique window right now that is not going to last and stay open forever, that could be taken by Israel, could be taken by Israel and America, could be done by America, but this is an important moment in time that I hope we don't look back at 5-10 years from now and say, we missed our chance.
Right. Let's hope the relevant people hear you. So we're going to move to Q&A. We have quite a few questions, and so I will ask both everyone, let's do short questions and short answers. But just before we turn to Q&A, Mark Sachs, our director in the Southeast, please, a few words.
Hello, everybody. Wonderful conversation. Thank you both. This has been really, really interesting to listen to. And since we have Zoom to say, interesting to watch. You know, as David mentioned at the outset, 2024 has been an extraordinarily complicated year, full of devastating lows and unbelievable highs. And to borrow Yaakov's earlier sentiment, full of mind-blowing delusions. Throughout all of this, European countries and the EU Parliament have been also taking extraordinary measures that Israel could not have done without. In these past few months alone, more and more European countries are pushing back on the ICC's arrest warrants of Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant. And France, Germany, and the UK have notified the UN Security Council of their intentions to snap back sanctions on Iran. No doubt, correlation does not mean causation, but there is no doubting the correlation between the dozens of delegations and 300 delegates ELNET led to Israel just this year alone, not to mention the hundreds of delegations and thousands of delegates we have taken since inception, and the pro-Israel actions being taken by European countries. All of this is to say thank you to each and every one of you who have helped make this happen. There are still 2 weeks left in our fiscal year, so there is still time for you to lend your tax-deductible support or further your support for ELNET into what is going to be a very busy 2025. You may head over to our website, donate there, send in a check, or contact any one of the regional directors, ELNET's regional directors, Sia Kordestani in the West, Sari Steinbrück in the Midwest, Jay Haberman in the Northeast, and me in the Southeast. Again, thank you for helping make ELNET as successful as it is. We couldn't do this without your support and your partnership. Daniel, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. For our first question, I'd like to turn to John Mearsh, who's going to ask about another regional actor here. Please unmute yourself.
Thanks so much. So yes, let's not forget about Qatar. So I'd like it if you could discuss Qatar's role. And my feeling is if Qatar ordered and pressured Hamas to release the hostages, they would have been released months ago. Why don't we do more to massively step up pressure on Qatar in every which way possible? Why don't we stop giving Qatar a pass?
You know, John, I think it's a great question, and I wish I had a really good answer for you, but it is one of the great mysteries of what has happened since October 7th, right? The fact that even if we think back to prior to October 7th, that you had a government in Qatar that was giving sanctuary and safety and housing and billions of dollars to the leaders of Hamas, murderers, terrorists, and at the same time, the Americans having a base of operations on that tiny little island is in itself absurd, right? There was no reason years ago that the U.S. Navy SEALs couldn't go in and arrest Ismail Haniyeh or Khalid Mashal or any of these other people who are based in Qatar. Why did we have to wait until now to suddenly even ask these questions? And I think that this is something that really requires some deep understanding. Why is it that Israel allowed the Qataris to send billions of dollars to Hamas over a period of years? Literally, we allowed money into Gaza. We paid extortion money to Hamas. I don't know what was going on in the Israeli government, but like that's Godfather 101. You never pay protection to the mafia, right? And we did that, and we allowed that to happen. Why? Why did we think that would work? So I think there's a lot of questions that we're going to have to ask, and we still require answers to.
Let's also not forget they're the ones funding a lot of what's happening at our universities and our campuses here.
They're funding a lot of what's happening at universities. They are funding, and look at what they do with Al Jazeera, by the way, right? Al Jazeera not only put aside its anti-Semitism, put aside its hatred of Israel, the brainwashing and the propaganda and the way that it disseminates and it spews and it riles up the Arab street against us. This is supposed to be an ally of the United States. This is a country that President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken said has been upgraded to one of the highest level of a non-NATO state ally. How does this make sense, and how do we allow this to happen? And when I ask, by the way, Qataris, who I speak to, who say to me, you know, Al Jazeera, we don't really have control, you know, free media independence, I'd laugh. I'm like, listen, I was the editor of a newspaper for over 7 years, okay? In a democracy where we actually have freedom of media. But you have an owner. When your owner calls you up, even when you're the editor of a newspaper, you take that call and you listen really carefully. You guys are funding Al Jazeera. You really think I'm going to believe that you're giving them freedom of media? Come on. So this whole world of absurdity has to come to an end, and Qatar has to be held accountable. And their two-faced game that they have played, and I'm just looking at, I don't know what stadium that is behind you, but how they have bought up football teams like PSG, right, Paris Saint-Germain, how they have bought up cultural institutions, how they have bought up, you know, whether it was the World Cup or other things around the world, all to be able to launder and clean themselves. Well, we need to make it very clear that that is not something that we're willing to accept or ignore, and they have to be held accountable. And I think you're 100% right that earlier pressure on them could have made a difference. But I think they also had us between a rock and a hard place. And in Israel, I understand we didn't have another mediator and go between us and Hamas, and we had no choice but to use them. So this is how they've always made themselves to be indispensable. On the one hand, support the terrorists. On the other hand, smile to the West.
Right, thank you. For the next question, from Maria Poncillo, forgive me if I pronounce your name not correctly. She asked for me to read the question for her. She would be happy to hear your comment on the ICC warrants against Israel, and the inexistent ones against the rest of the whole of the terrorists around us, basically.
I mean, look, I'm not a legal expert. I do happen to have a law degree, but never really did anything with it. But I think that what we all recognize is that one of the fronts that Israel today faces, there's obviously the military fronts in Gaza and Lebanon, but there's also going to be I call it the legitimacy front. And this is where media and public diplomacy, but also places like the ICC or the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, where we also brought up on charges of genocide, is where we have to fight for our legitimacy. Now, there are a lot of people here in Israel say, why is this important? Well, it is important. And I think that you all understand that, because if you want to get the support of the world, if you want to continue to get the weapons that we need to fight, the aid that we need to get those hands up and votes in the United Nations, we need to be able to explain and be seen as fighting a legitimate and just war. So even with that said, I think we could be doing a tremendous more. We could have even done more on the ICC. We could have done more potentially on humanitarian aid. We could have potentially tried to fight back earlier when knowing that this might have been coming. But even if we had, does that mean that the Karim Khan, the prosecutor, would not have submitted a warrant or issued a warrant against Netanyahu and Gallant? I can't say, and probably he still would have. But here's the absurdity. And this is where you understand what is really at the root and the foundation of what the ICC has done. This is anti-Semitism, right? This is anti-Zionism. This is singling us out for demonization and delegitimization and holding us to a double standard. And you know how I know that? Bashar al-Assad, a man who has murdered 500,000 of his own people, who has used chemical weapons against innocent Syrians, no arrest warrant against him by the ICC last time I checked.
He's just an eye doctor.
He's just an ophthalmologist, exactly. How does that make sense? How is that a reality that we're willing to accept? So again, look, America, not a signatory to the Rome Statute. But I know that ELNET, I know you guys are at the forefront of really pushing on this in Europe. But the European countries that have signed on to the Rome Statute, and now this is the big test, because it's not about whether Netanyahu can go for a weekend with his wife to Paris. It's not about whether he can travel next to Argentina, right? We'll figure out those specifics. And either he'll be able to go or he won't be able to go. And we'll be okay in that sense. But this is about the future of what kind of world do we want to see and what kind of world do we want to have? And if this is the way that the world, the greatest institutions, the places that were established to prevent the greatest acts of genocide that were perpetrated against us as a people, if this is how they operate, then what are they worth? Nothing. And that means really at the end of the day that these institutions are worth nothing. And that might be the reality, but that's an unfortunate and sad reality.
In a very connected topic, I'd like to turn to our next question from Harold Eisenman to follow up on that. Harold? I think you're muted.
I thought I unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Yaakov, for what you do. My question is, clearly visible anti-Semitism in Europe is on the rise. My maternal grandmother was born in Ireland, which is shaming itself promoting the genocidal myth by Israel. Do you see any hope of improvement in Israel, in Europe in this regard?
Well, I think it's a good question, Harold. And, Ireland is really, it's a whole separate conversation. I'm no expert in Ireland, but what is it about Ireland that it's such a vile, visceral hatred of Israel and of the Jewish state is really, it's a whole story in of itself, and goes more, says more about the Irish than it does about Israel. But I think when you look at Europe as a continent, you are seeing interesting trends and changes that are taking place there, right? Whether it's with the elections that have taken place recently in the European Parliament, whether it's in elections that have taken place in some European countries, we're seeing changes. Now, some places you have the far right that's taking over. Sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where far-right politicians actually are more favorable to Israel. And Israelis have to, and Israel and the Jewish communities have to navigate some of those complexities of, do we want to accept these friends who might be friends to us, but could sometimes come from parties that have histories of being anti-Semitic and the likes. And there's a number of stories of that in different countries, whether it's Austria and other places throughout Europe. So it's obviously very complicated. And I think that really at the core is a genuine understanding by some people in Europe and also in America and around the world that the battle that Israel is fighting is a battle that really is all of the West and all of the free world really face, right? It is the question of whether we want to allow these forces of darkness, of radical Islam, to take hold and to take control of what's happening in these countries. And, yes, sometimes it comes out with xenophobia, and it seems like there's racism and discrimination when it comes to conversations about immigration and the likes. And I get that sensitivity. But these are real challenges and real threats. When you look at what happened in Montreal just a couple weeks ago, where you have rioters and people on the streets of Montreal burning an effigy of Prime Minister Netanyahu, smashing stores and cars, blowing up little explosive incendiary devices, when you have shots fired at synagogues in places like Canada, a country that's meant to be so accepting, so diverse, so peaceful, what went wrong? Well, something bad has happened there. And multiculturalism is not going to be the answer right now. So I don't want to wade into the whole immigration question, way above my pay grade. But I think that what we're all seeing right now happening is that these are real conversations that every country today recognizes they have to deal with.
Thank you. And on that note, first of all, thank you, Yaakov, for a great conversation.
Thank you.
On a more of a personal note, as David mentioned earlier, on the symbolic last call of the year, I'd like also to share that it will be my last before I'm leaving ELNET at the end of the month and joining the Israeli public sector. I just want to say that it has been a privilege to see so many of you from afar join every week and listen and support our work consistently. I will never forget that one Monday when I rushed back from the south, one of our first solidarity missions with parliamentarians back in October or November 23 in the south of Israel, to make it on time to moderate one of these calls and to see a record numbers of participants tuning in to hear more about our work and updates from whatever's horrible sights that we've seen in the south that day. But that assured me that we're not alone. So let me just briefly say a genuine and heartfelt thank you. Without your help, none of this would have been possible. Now I'd like to turn to Tom Flesch, our chair-elect, for closing remarks. Just have to unmute, Tom.
It is also a time that is bittersweet for me to say goodbye and wish you well in your next chapter in your career. It has been a pleasure working with you. You've brought really great interviews and very interesting ones to our viewing public, and I thank you so much for that. Mark, you articulated a lot of our accomplishments during the year. And Yaakov, it is always such a great experience to hear your vision and to hear your commentary on the events that take place. I would say that 2024 was a very interesting year, very tumultuous. A lot of things that happened, some anticipated and mostly were not anticipated. And we rose to the occasion to keep our audience tuned in with information that we could do to the latest, most accurate, and at the same time maintaining support from our European constituency. Not always easy, and always with some kind of challenge, but I think we navigated through that quite successfully. And quite frankly, our success with new offices, new exposure, we have an Italian office, we have new offices in the States for fundraising that have been very successful and have raised our costs. But we are really building momentum. our viewership, our support, and quite frankly, our European friends look to us for a lot of guidance with the relationship with Israel. And I hope for a new year that's filled with continued success and continued support from our supporters, which is vital for us to continue doing our work. And I want to just thank everybody for what they've done and what they continue to do. And Larry, a personal note to you, Larry Hochberg, that you're my mentor and you've been so supportive during this transition. Well, it's not complete transition because it's the best thing that can happen to ELNET for Larry to stay involved as he does, and he does every day still. And we have a great organization. So to our viewers, thank you for viewing. Thank you for tuning in. Please continue to support us. There's still another week left so that we can meet our needs and build for next year. And as Yaakov said, there's going to be a lot of work to do. It'll be humanitarian, building business relationships with Israel next year, not just things that are war related, but there will be a lot of things to rebuild. And hopefully our role with the European support for Israel become even more important. So there's a lot to do. We are ready to face all of our challenges and preparing to do so. So with that thought, I want to say to everybody a happy, healthy new year. And we look for strength to strength and for the better times ahead. And God bless Israel. God bless the Jewish people. And God bless all of our supporters at ELNET in Europe and the United States to continue doing this very, very important work. So that's my closing comment. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Yaakov, for joining us.